Hi, Marcus.
Hi, Richard.
How are things going? How are you finding lockdown?
Lockdown has its challenges, but generally we've now kind of got used to it. But I think at the beginning we had that sort of rabbit in the headlights sort of couple of weeks, and I think that sort of business slowed down up till Easter, and then after the Easter break, I think everybody got used to the fact that working from home was the new norm, and things just zoomed up, and we were sort of back into a new normal. So yeah,
I think we've been finding a very similar experience, actually. It's kind of new normal. I know that term's been bandied around a lot, but it does seem to have it does seem to be becoming reality for us all, doesn't it? It's everything's changed basically, and I think it will be like that for a while. So
yes, no, we agree. Unless you're working on a building site, it seems the office space is definitely going to change.
Yeah, for sure. So before we start, maybe would be helpful for the audience if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself and your role and where you come from, etc.
So my name is Marcus Evans. I'm the European Head of Data Privacy for Norton Rose Fulbright. And Norton Rose Fulbright is a very big international law firm with offices all over the world. So I'm exposed to privacy issues of multinationals of all over the world, and I have to kind of coordinate those issues across jurisdictions every day.
Cool. And yeah, I mean we've done a couple of events together on this kind of topic before, so I know you've got some really interesting insight from the type of engagements you're getting involved in. So I appreciate you taking part today in the conference for us. So I guess the first question I had for you was how the COVID-19 situation has been affecting you and your own business.
Well, I think, as I said earlier, that the kind of initial stages were our business levels went quiet for a kind of couple of weeks, or at least quieter as people tried to evaluate whether projects should go on or shouldn't. And then we had a wave of well, even in those 2 weeks, we had lots of queries about how to deal with lockdown, and particularly the privacy implications of dealing with lockdown and what you could or couldn't ask your employees, and sort of how you dealt with information relating to infected employees, and whether you could tell their colleagues that somebody had been infected so that the colleagues could then go and get tested or isolate, etc. And so we had an awful lot of queries of that nature. But then, as I said, it went a little quiet, and then people started to realize the world kept spinning, and a lot of big projects have now sort of kicked off again. So we are kind of back to normal, but we just don't all get in to the same room, and that does have its challenges. Yeah,
I can imagine that the legal profession is not traditionally an online profession, is it? So it's it must present you with a few unique challenges in that regard.
Well, in some respects, it's been positive in that I run a very international practice, and so most of our clients we have dealt with through conference calls and emails for years, but we've always traveled to conferences and to sort of meet the clients from time to time, but the majority of the work is done through email and calls. I think what this has done has brought video conferencing into the mainstream, and I'm sure that sort of everybody has zoomed every single one of their relatives by now. But that is something which we are doing, and it certainly makes the attention span on conference calls better when people know that they're being watched in a gallery. So that's good from a perspective of sort of managing your own team if you want to make sure that everybody's paying attention. But it's also very good. We operate various networks. So we have a privacy officers network which we operate, where 15 privacy officers meet every sort of 6 weeks, and we've done 2 of those during the lockdown, where we've had the gallery screen, and we've had almost the same level of kind of sharing and sort of free flow. It's not quite as good as having a room when somebody can interrupt and the other person keep talking. Zoom tends to sort of let only one person speak at a time, which requires a certain etiquette.
Yeah, it does require a slightly different way of working, doesn't it? But everyone's getting used to it, I suppose. So I know that you're working with a lot of data privacy challenges across your clients. So are there any kind of themes that you're seeing in terms of the challenges they're facing, and you know, what specific problems are coming up in that regard? Yes,
I mean, I think that I think there's sort of probably 3 areas. There's one is sort of how to deal with immediate privacy impacts of COVID, and in that it's at this stage in time it's the return to work. And so, are you going to ask your employees to tell you their symptoms? Are you going to ask them what their temperature is, or test their temperature is before you let them back into the office? If they come into the office, how are you going to trace whether they have been close enough to another employee if they become infected? And clearly this is something which governments around the world are trying to solve through their own contact tracing efforts and through the use of apps. We're doing a lot of work with multinationals on kind of how they're going to address this in their workplaces and what the privacy issues are on that. Because if you are in America, the rules restraining you from giving your employees an app which allows you to kind of track where they've been at work, and even where they've been outside of work, are much less stringent than in Europe, where if you tried to give somebody an app which actually kind of tracked their location outside of work, it would be virtually impossible to introduce from a privacy perspective. And so we're seeing kind of countries come up with some very good solutions, technological solutions, but which have a privacy downside, in that your employer sort of knows what you're up to at any moment, and that's something which European data protection law is very protective of. And so solutions which work in one country don't necessarily work in other countries, and multinational clients are really scratching their heads as to how to find a sort of common path through all the different laws to be able to roll something out across lots of jurisdictions.
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously seeing a lot of, well, every business is having to adapt various parts of their strategy, and I guess we're seeing some relaxation in various, you know, laws that are very difficult to maintain, and regulations that are difficult to maintain under the current circumstances. I mean, are you seeing any relaxation in the approach from a legislative perspective?
It's a bit of both. That the area where the law bites here is you're essentially using the personal data to comply with your health and safety obligations. So to make sure that you have a safe workplace for the employee and the others in the workplace. And that's an incredibly sort of vague standard in terms of sort of how much personal data do you need to collect to keep your employees safe, that without guidelines as to what you need to do, you're sort of making it up as you go along. And so at the beginning, we were having to make it up as we went along, and that was very, very uncomfortable, and that tends towards more conservative advice. But then as it rolls on a bit and regulators from different countries kind of put their head above the parapet and start to articulate where the acceptable limits should be, then it becomes easier to borrow something from one jurisdiction and use it in another and say that looks like a sensible dividing line. Let's use that when we don't have the precision in our own country. So that's kind of they haven't really relaxed the rules, but they've filled in some of the gaps. And in some respects, some jurisdictions are actually going to tighten the rules. So, for example, on the NHS contact tracing app, the House of Lords Human Rights Select Committee is urging to have legislation to limit what the government can do with the centralized data that it receives from the contact tracing apps, so that makes people more trustworthy or trusting of the government to receive that information. I think that's necessary to kind of get it off the ground and necessary to comply with the human rights law. And I think that the final bit of relaxation is that the ICO has given guidance saying that it's not going to sort of follow up on sort of dotting I and crossing T's type compliance measures, but it's still going to focus on the ones which really matter. So it's still going to follow up on data breaches. But one example which is quite interesting is that it had a big investigation into the ad tech industry, which was just about to come to conclusion, and that has been delayed for 6 months. I think just because it didn't seem appropriate to sort of upend an industry in these times. Yeah,
it's interesting. We hear this term outside of the legal profession. We hear this term legal precedent, and of course, when you've got an unprecedented situation, you're having to kind of make it up as you go along, as you say. But the precedence is kind of one of the key cornerstones of law, isn't it? So if you haven't got that, it's a very uncomfortable place, I can imagine, for you guys. So.
It can be. It can be. That's for sure.
So are there any other things? It's interesting you say about the helping clients with how they handle the data that they're now describing, or currently tackling how they're going to handle that sort of health data. Are you speaking to any clients about challenges around data that they would normally be uncomfortable having outside of the office environment, but now they're obviously having to take that work home?
Yes, I mean the sort of working remotely piece. I think most businesses sort of had a working from home option, but it wasn't used to the extent it's being used now. And I think that the Information Commissioner's Office has published a sort of 10 tips for working from home, all to do with sort of, if you print out paper, then that's something which could fall into the wrong hands. Watch where you're having your telephone conversation, etc. Make sure you use the work provided VPN systems. Don't put it on your sort of personal laptop. And so, the risks are risks which are kind of well trodden. Zoom, I guess, was the risk which everybody hadn't quite worked out before the lockdown, but there's been a lot of publicity about that, and people have worked out how to configure Zoom properly so that you don't get Zoom bombed or have everybody recording stuff they shouldn't be recording. But we most of our clients are fairly sort of large corporates, and so they've kind of got policies on this and the sort of hardware to deal with it. That I think it probably is worth them reminding their staff sort of the do's and don'ts, in that I think it's quite easy for people to make up a workaround which is horrendous from a security perspective, and unless they're actually reminded of that, they will just carry on with it. But I think one other aspect which surprised us about the lockdown, and we think is to do with remote working, is that in the first 2 to 3 weeks after the lockdown, we run a data breach hotline for a big insurer, and we normally see 2 or 3 breaches a week come through that hotline on a sort of global basis. And we didn't see any for 2 weeks, which we were very surprised by, because we thought, with all of this remote working and with criminals taking advantage of kind of COVID emails to sort of get phishing attacks in, we were expecting a huge spike of that, and it didn't happen. And then a couple of weeks later, it's got back to the sort of the levels it was before. And we are unfortunately seeing a sort of huge amount of ransomware in corporate networks. That ransomware seems to be, the exploit at the moment, which is sort of present, and the little lull, which was rumored to be because Iraqi hackers maybe had the COVID virus and weren't as busy as they were before, was one apocryphal rumor on this. But I think it may just have been that sort of corporate IT departments were busy rolling out people with sort of laptops and desktops and remote stuff, and so perhaps took their eye off the ball as to what's happening in their SOC.
Just distracted from these topics, I suppose, for at least a period. It's interesting that you're seeing things getting back to normal. It's that kind of new normal we talked about earlier, isn't it? So,
yes.
So, I mean, do you have any specific? I mean, you've obviously given a couple of recommendations there anyway, but were there any specific recommendations you can sort of provide in terms of how clients can follow good data privacy practices in the current environment?
I think probably dust off your remote working policy and give your employees a refresher training and make it compulsory would be the most important element. One element which perhaps isn't so obvious is I would not encourage your employees to use WhatsApp to communicate about office matters. It's obviously not a channel which is on your corporate server. So if something goes wrong, you're not going to be able to get a hold of those records. You can't monitor it. I mean, there are applications to monitor WhatsApp, but they're quite complicated to roll out and to do in a privacy compliant manner. And so I think it's from our perspective, it seems to be the way to sort of make sure that breaches don't happen is to give people the means to use the VPN or other sort of remote access in a way that they're going to actually use those tools rather than find the workarounds. But outside of that, it's other than to contact tracing, it's business as usual for a privacy practice.
That's interesting. And in terms of the kind of new normal everybody's talking about, do you think any legislation or any kind of any laws in this area will change fundamentally on a permanent basis as a result of this, or do you think it will be literally business as usual?
I can't think of anything which is sort of completely ripe for a change in my world, in the privacy world, as a result of this. Maybe I'm being a bit unimaginative, but
you mentioned the health data earlier. I mean, I think I guess it's finding that balance between obligations that companies have for from a health and safety perspective and their obligations for data privacy, and eventually that balance will be found where perhaps we will hold more health data than we used to, maybe.
I don't think so. I think what's going to happen is that this temporary relaxation is actually it is anticipated by the law, because the the necessity is so extreme here that the law is allowed to flex for that extremity.
So it's already there. It's just
correct.
Interpretation. Okay.
Exactly. But when the extremity goes, then it will be less justifiable. And one of the things with all of these apps is how long you're retaining the data for and when you're going to get rid of it. And so it's meant to be a temporary blip whilst we kind of get through this tracing phase. It is not meant to be a hangover. I mean, a lot of privacy specialists sort of worry about this being the thin end of the wedge and leaving a legacy of tracing. I personally think that there's been enough media attention for that not to be the case, in that people are aware of it. So I'm more optimistic than others on that. Okay,
cool. And talking about being optimistic and the other topic that we all used to care about, just to ask something on a non-COVID topic, where do you think, assuming we are leaving the EU still at the end of this year, where do you think the GDPR regulations leave us from a Brexit perspective? How do you think Brexit might affect that?
I think that we'll have our version of the GDPR, whatever happens at the end of the transition period. I mean, we obviously have Brexited. We're not in the European Union at the moment, but we're under a transition period where the GDPR, the EU GDPR, continues to apply to the UK. At the end of that transition period, we'll flip over to our own version of the GDPR, which is, to all intents and purposes, identical.
Has that already been written then?
Yes, it's already been written. I mean, it literally is just the GDPR with another instrument which says replace the European Data Protection Board with the ICO, and it's sort of how to rewrite the law without having to copy it all out again. So
a very hasty cut and paste job.
Exactly. You could say that. But the one real fly in the ointment is whether we get adequacy. So in order for personal information to flow freely out of the European Union to a third country, you need the European Commission to say that your data protection regime is the same or equivalent to the EU's. And you would have thought that the UK, having been part of the EU sort of up until the end of January, would definitely have an adequate regime. But there have been a spate of cases to do with surveillance, and particularly surveillance in the US, which found the US system not to be adequate, and which are quite possibly going to be turned on the UK system just at the time that the Commission is deciding whether the UK system is adequate or not. And there is one decision which is due to be published on the 16th of July as to whether the EU model clauses, which are used to export data all around the world, are valid for export to the US. And we are all keenly awaiting that. If it goes the wrong way and says they are not valid, some of the principles that case will decide are going to be very, very relevant for whether the UK gets an adequacy finding. And so this whole question of whether data from Europe can flow to the UK without having EU model clauses or some other control is quite live, and is going to be what we're going to be focusing on from July onwards, I think.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. I guess adequacy also includes how you police things, not just what's written down, doesn't it? So that's the other element of that.
Very much so. It's how you police the police, because it's the security services getting access to data in the country that you're exporting it to, which is the whole crux of this case. So in the US example, it was that Facebook's data was in a server in the US, and the US intelligence services were able to dip into it via PRISM and those programs which were running there. And so the kind of accusation is that the UK has kind of similarly sort of inquisitive intelligence services, and that the controls aren't sufficient here. And if that was the case, then the EU Commission could say we can't give you adequacy because of that intelligence service access to data which is in the UK.
Well, let's hope it works itself out.
16th of July.
So thank you very much for taking part. I really appreciate your time today, and I'm sure the audience are going to be very grateful for the insight there. It's very, very, very helpful.
Pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks, Marcus.